So how do we manage all of this in practice? Um, First of all, regardless of what the area of our lives is, whether it is our time, our our faith formation, our financial resources, our relationships, the good creation that God has given us, we begin in prayer. Because if we want to manage this in accordance with God's wishes, we need to seek what God's will is for that area. We want to put God first in our time. So at the beginning of each day, we set a time aside to be present with God. Now, for some people, they're better off doing that at the end of the day. It depends on your own body's rhythms and such. But to set that time aside for God, for our resources. So, for example, with finances, we put God first at the top of our budgets. Our family budget has a Bible verse at the very top of it. But also in terms of our giving, we'll get there later on that. We need to watch out for impulses that can turn into addictions, because our culture is really good in various ways at grabbing us and pulling us off track where God would long for us to go. Technology, this is one that I personally struggle with. Technology is great in moderation, but how addicted are we to these crazy things, right? It used to be, to use the phone, not only did you have to be at home, you had to be connected to a wall. Many of you remember those phones. I remember one growing up of that way. Not anymore. Now we carry them all around with us every time, all the time. And oh, by the way, they don't just make phone calls. They do texting. You can play games on them. You can do social media on them. And it's scary how much they have turned into addictions for us. I know personally for myself, when I get caught up in those things, I find it hard to still my soul to pray, contemplatively for an extended period, because my mind has become scattered. Again, how we utilize these God-given resources impacts our relationship with God, not just the other way around, not just as impacted by, but also impacted. Similarly, from a financial standpoint, impulse purchases, right? Now, again, this can be done in moderation, but this can quickly turn into an addiction. And not only will it throw off finances personally, but also can impact our relationship with God. The goal of this all, in every area of life, I think, is simplicity and generosity. Simplicity is a life filled with the essentials. 1 Timothy 6:8 says, but if we have food and clothing, we will be content with these. A life where the basic needs are met. And let's face it, there are folks out there in the world that don't. And that's where we direct many of our social ministries. It's also a life filled with contentment, where, as Paul says, I have learned to be content with whatever I have, to lack or to be in need or to not lack. Either way, whether times are good or times are bad, to be content, settled in God. And then generosity, giving ourselves away for the sake of others. Our time, volunteering, our talents, using those for the goods of others, our possessions, both financial and otherwise, our relationships, giving ourselves away, not just for those in our family, but for those in the community of faith, with our relationships with those whom we serve. You see, the goal here is living simply and giving our lives away. Jesus says, those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will find it. But I know I'm preaching to the choir. Okay. It really is pretty simple. We humans need to give. There's a wonderful book out there, you can see it on the screen, called The Paradox of Generosity. Giving we receive, grasping we lose. by Christian Smith and Hilary Davidson. In this book, and it's a secular book looking at generosity and people's lives. And they found that people who give in various ways, this is not just financial giving, and definitely not just financial giving to the church, but a broad range of measures of giving, they tend to be happier, they have better social connections, they are healthier, they experience lower stress, they tend to be wealthier, they tend to live longer lives. And interestingly, you would assume that those who are happier, healthier, wealthier, live longer lives would be more generous. But actually, they found the link to go the other direction. That when we are generous in our lives, it leads to these outcomes. The links are actually causal for it. That's curious, isn't it? You would think that those who would give would be poorer because they've given some of it away, right? And in some cases, they become just so obsessed with giving, and then it doesn't provide those benefits. There is a small subset of people where giving really has almost become impulsive, become an addiction. I have to give, I have to give, I have to give. In that situation, the benefits don't play out. But for the vast majority of folks, when they do give themselves away, they find life. And so here's one reason why I think this is true. In Genesis 1:26, it says, we are made in the image of God. I find that curious. You know, for years, you cannot make a graven image of God. You know, that's one of the commandments according to a different listing. A Lutheran listing doesn't include that. But God has already made images of God's self. Just look in the face of each other. Each of us in a unique way reflects the divine image, the divine beauty. God, by very nature, is a giver. So if we're made in the image of God, it makes sense that it would be within our truest nature to be givers as well. And so because of that, giving brings us incredible joy. By this, I don't mean fleeting happiness. You know, Jesus says, I've said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete, filled to the brim. And then he says, you know, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. One can give without loving, but one cannot love without giving. So when we do give, when we give ourselves away, we find this joy, the same joy that God experiences in giving us all good things. You know, remember at the end of creation, God looked and saw indeed it was very good, right? And so we get to experience some of that same joy as we participate in the creative generosity of God. All right, let's get down to some brass tacks. How should we give and how much? From Deuteronomy 26, 1 through 11, beautiful passage, we give first fruits, some of the first of the fruit of the land. Now, this was designed for a summer festival for the ancient Israelites. It was an act of trust on their part because when they gave first fruits, they didn't know if the rest of the harvest was going to come in later in the fall, or if a drought or a flood might wash it all away. In our practice, you know, many of us have a somewhat regular stream of income. We have a budget, a plan to spend the money we receive, and the top expense item on the budget is giving, because we give first fruits. And then we trust God to provide enough to cover our other expenses. Now, the technical how in our giving can occur in many ways, as we discussed earlier. And by the way, this giving doesn't just need to be to the church, although I believe that a large percentage of it should be, because the church is where we first learned the reason for giving and received the greatest gift of all, salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. We received by grace through faith, through the ministries of the church. Now, the biblical standard for giving, and by the way, think about this also in this standpoint of time, is tithe, 10% of income. I wonder if we're giving 10% of our time away to God, spending time with God in prayer, serving others. Are we giving that 10%? That's an interesting question and a challenging one. And when it comes to finances, this standard of a tithe, we aren't even close to as Lutherans. As a median number, the median Lutheran household gives 0.62% of their income to their congregation. Now, why do I mention median here? Normally, when you talk average, those who are mathematically inclined, you talk about the mean. You add up the percentages of income that people give to their local church, and you divide by the number of people. Median is the middle number. So if I laid them all out, this person gives nothing, this person gives 0.1%, this person gives 10%. Lay them all out, the middle number would be 0.62%. The reason I give that is the mean is a good bit higher because there are people at the top that skew it. Similar to why we talk about the median household income in our country compared to the average mean household income, because you have the billionaires of the world that completely skew the number up. Back to tithing. Tithing, I think, is not necessarily a good word to use anymore, just because it's such a churchy word, and there are folks who are nowhere close to it. I think the tithe is a very good standard. My family and I tithe. We go beyond a tithe, and we're grateful that we can do it. But what is better is to encourage growing in generosity. Pastor Mike Ward, who is a partner with GSB, Gronlund Sather Bronco, our partners in the Synod doing stewardship education, mentioned he had a couple in their congregation who started out and they said, we can't give a tithe, but what we will do is we'll start at whatever percent and we will increase it 1% per year. By the time the husband died and Mike knew them, they were giving away 38% of their income, because they grew it 1% per year, year after year after year, growing in generosity.